Story 1. I know what this is going to sound like. A legend. Sailor's yarn. No one believed me when I first told this story, and I don't expect anyone to believe me now. But just listen. It's been a while since I last thought about this one. It's been even longer since I last went to sea. Because of what I'm about to tell you, to be clear. Because I know what's waiting for me out there, itching to get a bite of me. She haunts my dreams and all waking nightmares, and I'm never quite sure she's not in fact waiting around the next corner. I lived at the coast back then. It made sense. I earned my living working on boats and ships. Sometimes maintaining engines, sometimes taking care of security, keeping an eye on the horizon, on the weather, on passengers. Be they civilians or other workers like me that my employers didn't trust much. Those were the easiest, I have to say. Being shipped around the ocean, sitting and watching the waves rise on our sides, seeing all the wonders the oceans have to offer. How I miss them now, but none of them are worth it. Not the glistening silver moon reflecting off the ocean surface all around. Not the occasional swarm of colourful fish just beneath the surface, or the blow of a whale, its fin coming up out of the water. I'm not one to give up quickly, not a job, not a life like this. Before, I would never have even thought to give up on those nightly sights, these moments that I would revel in at the end of the day. Now, I wouldn't go back for $1 million, not for a single job. It was the usual, a night job no one else wanted to take. A full shift at the engine of an expedition into the Mediterranean Sea. Not the best pay, considering the times, but I took anything I could get. They never told me why they went out there, why they spent the night out on the sea. I never asked. The boat was small, a crew of 15 people. Barely a need for someone like me. I didn't know any of them, which was unusual. Most trips I took out, there was at least one person I'd worked with before, one person that lived next to me around the harbour. These people came from outwards, travelled, specifically to start their journey here. The boat, however, I had been on before, one of the most commonly used for this size of crew at our harbour. Maybe my favourite at some point. She was a masterpiece, carved perfectly to cut through waves like a hot knife through butter. The purr of her engine had always resonated with me, so I loved working with her, even if I mostly wandered her cabins as a security guard. I knew her like the back of my hand, had spent so many nights on her deck that she had become like a home to me. I don't like thinking about her now. I boarded the boat alongside a group of what seemed to be men of science, most of them lean and tall, talking in language I didn't recognize. With this kind of group, I was expecting heavy equipment, sonars, radars, all sorts of electrical displays. But they packed barely more than me with the small sleeping bag I had slung across my shoulder. I was the only outer hire on the expedition. Even the captain, a man I'd never seen before, one that arrived with them, someone who hadn't been in these waters before. I still remember how cold it was that day. Piercing wind that blew over the harbour picked up icy water and flung salt into my face. A captain from home, or even just someone who spoke my language, I would have talked to about the dark grey tint of the sea and the waves picking up high against the horizon. This one, standing atop the command cabin, holding onto nothing more than an antenna with one hand, the other waving to his mates making their way onto his ship and yelling the low tones of his foreign language, I couldn't even get close to. It would be all right, I told myself, that they must know what they were doing. Maybe a storm was what they were going for. Still, this journey more than most before, I made sure of my little ritual, grazing my hand along the upper hull of the ship before I went aboard. The engineer was a young guy, not too eager about his job, but at least he seemed to know what he was doing. His English was broken, but he seemed to understand me when I got him familiar with the ship's mechanisms and workings, even if he wasn't taking me too seriously. I began feeling like that one teacher trying to talk to the school jock about his potential, while he was watching and joining his friends in goofing off in the hallway behind me, thinking I wouldn't see those grimaces he was pulling. It didn't take me too long to get annoyed enough with him to leave him to his own devices. As I walked off, I could just hear him and his mates laughing behind me. The cabin I had been given to sleep in was an empty pantry, barely enough space to place my sleeping bag on the ground and lay in it. The door had no lock, so proper privacy was questionable, and I was right above the engine room. Quiet was something else. Sleep, something I shouldn't get to know. The hum, the constant drumming and creaking of the engine and the hull around me were things I had worked around before. But them, whatever they were doing, it sounded like they were tearing the ship apart. The day crept on without a second of rest for me, only the beginning of their footsteps, everywhere around. The howling of their voices down the metal halls, and the dull rustle of ever-growing waves crashing onto the side of the ship. I don't know when it all died down. I just remember lying in the dark, swayed in the belly of the ship, my eyes almost closing. I remember a head above mine, not a face, just skin stretching over bone and muscles moving underneath, trying to form words without a mouth. I remember seeing her so clearly, hovering, the skin laying over her teeth, tearing as her jaws stretched further and further, a muted whisper I couldn't quite hear. And then, her mouth ripped open, the skin snapped back to reveal a maw full of razor-sharp teeth, edges tinted red with the blood of her most recent victim, or that of her next. A blood-curdling scream, a cry so metallic, not that of a human in fear, but some kind of hunter, a predator. So loud my eardrums almost burst. I sat straight up within less than a second. She was gone. But light fell into my room, a dome of brightness in the door across from me. I blinked, squinted, and finally lifted my arms in front of my face to shield myself from the brightness. I only recognized him when he started talking, the other engineer, as he kept hidden in the darkness of the hall. I sleep now. You go. He still hesitated, finally lowered the damn flashlight from my face, and then tossed something over to me. A small box, labeled in Cyrillic symbols. But the picture on it I recognized. Wax earplugs. I looked up to thank him, but he was facing down the hall, anything to not look at me, as if he felt guilty for something. Loud was the last thing he said to me, momentarily pointing his flashlight towards the ground in the engine room underneath us. Then, he walked off. I didn't have a flashlight of my own, didn't need one on this ship. I found my way down to the engine room in the dark, followed the sound of her purr. I don't know what got me to do it in the end. Maybe the thought of having been stuck in the all-too-loud party of the crew all day, unable to rest or sleep. Maybe my already ringing ears and stinging eyes and the knowledge that I had a sleepless night before me, that I was tired already and didn't need the extra strain. But before I went into the engine room, I took out the box that he had given me, stuffed some bits of wax into my ears, just enough to dampen the noise, but not completely drown it out. The night felt long shortly after it had started already. I didn't have a clock, only the heated room I was working in and the constant rushing of water against the hull. The ocean was wild, alive at night, shaking us about enough for me to have to hold onto a railing to not be thrown against the engine. and as it went on, I could feel the pressure the lack of sleep had on me. My eyes were far too heavy, the swaying of the shop too enticing. I felt cold, even in the heat of the engine room, and the floor was constantly pulling on my limbs. My eyes closed, just for a second, and when they opened again, the sea had fallen silent. The ship was steady, the engine quiet. I wasn't even sure we were still moving. I almost panicked, thinking I had fallen asleep standing, missed something, that there was a problem with the engine. But when I started checking everything there was, the engine was completely fine. It shouldn't be running quiet. We should be moving. But the ship lay still. That's when I heard her, the voice of a woman humming a beautiful tune. It stirred something within me, something that made me drop everything I was working on, made me forget what I was doing. It was a song from my childhood. And then, one I had first heard in college. It was my prom dance, then the song that played to my first kiss. I made my way out of the engine room, heard the hum echoing through the halls, inviting me, calling for me. Somewhere, my name whispered again and again with a desire in her voice, as if I was the only thing that could save her, as if I was her lifeline, and she needed me. Now. I rushed through the ship, didn't even notice the doors that I passed, the cabins the rest of the crew were sleeping in, shaking in their frames. That was one of the things I only realized much later. I had to follow her. Had to. There was nothing else I could do, even if I wanted to. When I got to the door that led out onto the deck, I could see the other engineer. I don't even remember his name anymore. I'm not sure I ever asked for it. He was standing in the middle of the deck, silver light all around him, his head tilted back onto his neck as he stared into the sky. He opened his arms and called out in his own language. I knew what he was looking for, and I wanted the same. "Blake, come to me," she whispered. I only became more eager, rushed the last steps towards the door. "Blake." Her voice was all around me, everywhere and everything I wanted to hear for the rest of my life, or I wanted to die right that second. I remember that thought crossing my mind, so prominent, so strong. I was prepared, even imagining already, that I would throw myself into the ocean if her voice were to leave, if I couldn't find her. I was prepared to swim to the depths far enough to crush my body, if she would lead me there. It was the wind, the tiny specks of ice-cold water it carried with it now, and out here even more freezing than it had been at the harbour, blown into my face, that shocked me back into reality. Battered my eyelids, and the light disappeared. At the other end of the ship, the small control tower disappeared in the darkness. The ship snapped back into its sway, so quick that I lost balance and was thrown against the doorframe I was standing in. The noise, the roar of the waves, their heavy slapping against the hull of the ship, like shots going off right beside my ears. The growl of the engine, still loud up here, crashed down on me with the same intensity. I pressed my hands into my ears, yelled out, and can only think of pressing the wax further into my ears. Now I think that was what saved me. Stupid luck. He didn't have so much. He stood, unbothered by the noise, unbothered by the ground underneath his feet shaking harder than an earthquake. I wanted to call out to him, to call him back inside, but it was as if the sound was locked in my throat, a pressing pain. And then a shadow came over us, something blocking out the tiny bit of moonlight that managed to fall onto the wet deck. It was large, bigger than any bird I'd ever seen before, quicker than any cloud could have been. But there was nothing in the sky. Nothing in the sky. But when I looked back down, she stood in front of him. A beautiful woman, tall, long black hair, a dress just as dark complementing her curved shape. Her sight almost lulled me back in, almost convinced me to open my ears. But something about her shape was off. Something about her back too curved. Something about her chest too bulged. Something about her legs too bony. Her hand rose, cupped his cheek on the side I could not see. And then, her head split open. Her jaw unhinged like that of a snake. Her mouth dropped open, further and further. The smooth skin on her cheeks cracked open, flicked off to reveal red, pulsing flesh. Her hair and her dress puffed up. Not hair, not cloth, but feathers. Smooth and crusted in sea salt. Thousands of teeth peeked out from under her lips. Pitch black saliva dripped off the top row as she closed into the engineer and her mouth hooked around his entire face. She cut into his skin like butter, and he stood and held her and started to shake as the blood leaked from his neck, ran down his and her front, seeped into her feathers, which only seemed to revel in the warm liquid. I wanted to run, to turn, get away, even if I had to jump off the ship for it. But I was frozen in place, staring as he bled out in front of me, perfectly content with his end. I couldn't hear it, but I felt like I could. The crack, the breaking of his skull as she bit down, as his bones split apart, and the pink mass of his brain began to fall out. Her hungry slurp, swallowing up the bit of flesh she could salvage from the destroyed skull. She let him drop, fall to the swaying deck, where his body lay twitching, mauled face turned towards me. It couldn't have been more than a breath, nor more than air struggling to fill my lungs that made her notice me. Her head snapped around without her body following, grotesquely twisted over her neck, showing bones sticking out of the blood-covered skin. Her mouth still hung open, flesh hanging from between her teeth, her skin fallen in. Eyes pitch black gave her the image of a bloodied skull. The feathers around her face stood up, the skin they were buried into twitching as her full form rose up before me. A monster, twice my size, half bird, part human, or something that tried to be. Her maw gaped open, and the air began to shake. Blood-red saliva sprayed with a scream she let out, a noise I felt resonating in my bones, all too happy that the sound was blocked from my ears. She lunged forward, reached out with her razor-sharp talons at the joints of her gigantic wings. I caught control of myself enough to jump back, quick enough to slam the door before her. I don't know how long I sat, how long I held that door, waiting for her scratching, scraping, and screaming to stop. How many hits of the shaking, cracking door I took. I just remember seeing the captain standing in his command cabin, watching, undisturbed, unbothered. I left the ship with 14 men. The ship perfectly clean. The door that the monster had spent half the night tearing into shreds, untouched. They were as chipper as the moment we boarded, uncaring about their missing mate. According to them, he had never existed. But as I walked away, I could feel the gaze of the captain on me. That was my last sea job, the beginning of my last days living near it. I don't like to think about it. I like the nights that I can sleep without seeing her. But I saw her wings, and I know she can use them. And that she has my scent. Before I continue to the next story, I just want to say thank you for choosing to watch this video, and I hope you're enjoying my narration. If you are, please show your appreciation by liking this video, leaving a comment, and if you don't already, subscribing to this channel. Story 2. I don't think I've ever told anyone about this. Not my family, not friends, not my fiancé. I know what they would say, what they would do. They'd laugh, ask if I breathed in too many marsh fumes, if the alcohol we had been too much, if the sun had been too strong that day. They would try any reason, any explanation, any little things that would disprove the things I saw. I know they would, and who would blame them? I would too, in their place. I'm not sure I would even listen to a story like this. Of course, they noticed that something was off about me. Something still is. I came back never quite the same that day. Still look over my shoulder occasionally, even if I know that it can't be here. They're worried, but them I can't tell. Not them. But I have to get this off my chest. Out there, somehow, I don't care who listens or reads or gets to know what I have to say. It just needs to be out of my brain. Maybe that will get it out of my nightmares. We were on our engagement vacation, something we decided to treat ourselves to, paid out of pocket from the money we saved by not getting a ring. Sure, it wasn't fancy. It was no Caribbean, no Bali, but that, we decided, was something to look forward to on our honeymoon. And my fiancé had always dreamt of Scotland. Grass-green lands, nature, cliffs high above the wild waters, artworks of stone, shaped by the wind shooting up out of the hills. The Orkney Isles were everything we'd wished for. We took a plane to Wick, rented a car, and started our trip there. A ferry up to Cornwall, an overnight trip on storming waters, where she was goofing off around in the cabin, jumping up and over around the room, acting like she was causing the ship to move to distract me from my seasickness. I am so happy that she didn't come on that hike with me. We stayed in a little inn just outside of a small town. Rural, quiet, different than our usual busy city life. It was comfortable, perfect, the best vacation I had had so far. Despite the weather, despite grey skies and almost daily rain. We went out, hiked through nature, had picnics on top of hills and at the edge of cliffs, ran and danced through the rain and had drinks with the locals. I can't remember ever having been happier. And I remember being happy, but all too many times the only thought haunting me when that vacation comes up is the marsh. I've been talking around it for long enough now. Time to get why I'm really writing this. It had been one of those nights. We stayed out late, drank at the pub we'd come to like, the usual people sitting at the usual tables, the usual faces challenging us to the usual drinks. She is never one to turn down a challenge. It will always be one of the best things about her. The look in her eyes when she met a worthy opponent, for whatever it may be, was maybe what made me fall in love with her in the first place. You should see her when we break out the controllers for Mario Kart. How hard she concentrates on something that's nothing more than a game. What would I do without her? We didn't have any plans for the next day, so carrying her home after she lost for the 5th time wasn't an issue. Not to me, not to her. She clung to me like a baby ape, sat on my back all content with herself and the world. She's adorable when she's drunk, much more than anyone I had ever seen. She would get pouty only to spring up with a bright smile on her face half a second later. She would stick by my side as if glued to me, would tell me all the things drunk her thought she didn't tell me enough when she was sober. It was those nights that I stayed up, barely closing my eyes for a single minute, as I sat with her against my chest, listening to the sweetest hums and snores anyone had ever heard. and just held her. At some point it started raining. I still remember feeling so at ease, so calm. I wanted nothing more than to keep drinking in that moment. She was asleep in my arms by the time the sun rose above the horizon and poured light into our little room. The dark clouds had gone, the rain had stopped, and a nice, calming quiet had settled over us. It was then that I started getting tired. Then I finally nodded off, sunk deeper into the warm bed. And about then that my early alarm went off. I turned it off as quick as I could, now wide awake again, and for a moment I thought it'd been fast enough. But then she started writhing around, buried her face in my chest, only to finally push herself up with a groan and a curse on her lips. The one-day trip I had planned, the one route I wanted to go and see, specifically outside of everything that she had planned for us. I wasn't going to leave her behind. I wasn't going to go alone. Perfectly fine sitting this one out, even if I knew we wouldn't have time to come back around to this route anymore. What are you going to do? Just sit and watch me be miserable all day? She had rolled to my side and glanced at me from underneath her arm. When she pushed me off the bed with that loving, motivating smirk of hers, I couldn't stand my ground much longer. I never stood a chance against her. I darkened the room before I left, watched her to the last second as she tiredly waved from the bed. I drove out quite a bit, parked up the car in the middle of nowhere, and started making my way through the hills, barely a map with me, just a bit of information I'd looked at before. It was our constant need to go off the beaten path, to go where others hadn't been before, on untouched grounds, to feel away from society and fully immersed in nature. Now I'm thinking there's a reason why some parts of the world are left untouched, why some places are avoided by the general public, and the locals most of all. Never, never go where the locals wouldn't dare set a foot. There's always a reason. This time, the reason was a foul stench, a heaviness, still air over what should have been cleansed by the nightly rain. The ground I walked on was softened by the water, little paths in between murky ponds, a wide stretch of land dotted in water. I decided that a smell couldn't keep me from this, that I couldn't just let it turn me around to drive back home. So I went further into the wetlands. I didn't think anything of the lack of animals. I figured they had noticed me and hid from me. I didn't think anything of the quiet. It was early morning. Nature was supposed to be still. But as I walked further into the marsh, the world seemed to swallow my steps too. The sound of my breath faded to nothing, so slowly I could barely tell. And then, a new wave of the stench hit me. Foul, rotting flesh, as if something had died on every square inch of the land. The third warning I ignored. I just pulled up my scarf over my nose, trying to block it out from the smell of my fiancé's perfume still stuck in it from the other day. It wasn't only the stench in the end, it was what it did to me. The pictures it brought into my head. So vivid as if they were memories, but I had never seen such things, and never wanted to. I saw the torn-apart corpse of a child, one arm laying feet away, his face covered in blood, a chunk of his cheek missing. His stomach was bloated, like it was about to burst. Bite marks all over the little body. I saw a fisherman, his eyes stuffed with sand, his skin pulled off his face, bone and muscle laid free underneath. Something bent down to him. Teeth took hold of his cheek, rose back up and began to tear, to rip flesh from bone. Blood seeped out of the new bite marks, dripped down into the sand slowly. I heard the muscles starting to break, a long, wet tear as fibers snapped, and finally, the body dropped back to the floor, only to turn its eyes and look at me. My stomach twisted. I held a hand over my mouth, shook my head and kept my eyes shut to try and get rid of those pictures. But then I heard it again. The wet stretch, the slow snap and tearing, flesh moving against itself. I turned to face the sound. Just to my right, where the sun still stood low in the sky, I could make out the silhouette of something moving against the bright sky on a bit of raised land above me. The faint shape of a horse, its back turned to me, head raised high. The stench was unbearable now. The rottenness seemed to dig into my skin, crawled along my arms, buried beneath my flesh, began to infect me. I squinted to see better against the blinding brightness of the sun. Watched the horse move, turn sideways to me. It was then that I saw its real head, bent down to graze, and what I had first deemed its head now seemed like a rider. For a second, relief washed over me. Another person out here, someone who probably knew the area, could get me back to my car, because my shaking limbs really didn't seem like they could carry me back. I started to take a few steps towards it, only until it, too, took a step forward, and the rider's massive head blocked out the sun to give me a better view of both of them. The one thing, rider joint at the hips with his horse, growing out of his back. A head so big and heavy, he could barely keep it upright, so it just hung back loosely in his neck. What I had thought to be the rider's legs were arms, sprouting from his shoulders and hanging down to the floor. I stopped, froze as it moved. My heart was racing, my head spinning, but everything seemed slow. It constantly moved, pulsated, twitched. There was no skin, no fur, just bare flesh, dripping in a black substance. Muscles stretched over bones, riddled with pitch-black dips, holes from which a volley of flies emerged with every movement, only to settle back into their rotting holes. With every move, the wet smacking of its flesh echoed over the marsh. It slowly turned its head, the horse, towards me, stared with a single eye in the middle of its forehead. Its mouth dropped open, far, much further than it should be able to. Sinews stretched across its cheeks, struggling to keep the jaw attached. Something pulsated at the side of its face, a vein, sickly yellow, growing further until it burst. A stream of pitch-black blood shooting out of its side to sink into the marsh. And then, it let out a scream, a horrible gargling screech that finally snapped me out of my paralysis. The rider snapped up straight, showed his bloated head, the skeletal features visible under the tightly stretched muscle in the mouth so wide it split its head in half when he opened it. I turned, ran, as it bolted down the hill towards me. I didn't care what I stepped on anymore, just tried my best to push through the wetlands, with it on my heels. Pictures of mangled corpses flashing through my mind. I felt its breath right in my cheek, the heat of its rotting flesh, the stench so unbearable, the closer that it got. I didn't even think to turn when a shallow stream, a small river, crossed my path. I didn't think to run another way, keep my momentum instead of being slowed down by the water. I didn't think, because it was reaching its hands towards me. Its fingers grazed the back of my head, trying to grab a hold of me and pull me back. But the only thing it got was my hood. I felt the tug at my throat, did the only thing I could. I threw myself down into the stream. The buttons of the hood popped right off, ripped off my jacket, and I fell into the water. It was shallow enough for me to sit in it, slow enough not to be carried away. And still, I was down. That should have been the end for me. But when I looked up, it was gone. The foul smell now barely more than bad eggs, a sulfuric residue. The nausea hit me fully then. I threw up into the stream. I don't know how often, how long, Finally, I pulled myself to the other side, crawled up out of it, and looked back at the marsh that I had crossed, as if nothing had been there. It took me hours to find my way back to my car, not daring to cross to the other side of the stream again, and I could never quite shake off the feeling of something staring at me, of a single red eye craving for my flesh. I don't think that feeling has ever left me since. When my fiancée asked later, I couldn't tell her. I knew what she'd think, so I just said I had a run-in with nature. We left the same day, cut our vacation short, because I couldn't bring myself to go back out there. It's better in the city, with people around, with places I know. But sometimes at night, even here, I'll wake to the foul smells stuck in my nose, and for a moment feel like I see the shadow of a rider through the windows. Thank you for watching and/or listening to this video. Again, if you enjoyed it, please go ahead and hit the like button, and if you don't already, subscribe to my channel and select the notification bell so you don't miss out on any of my future uploads. Also, please leave a comment on this video letting me know what you thought of it. Comments really help with the YouTube algorithm and will really help my channel to grow. If you have a story you would like me to narrate, please email it to me at stories@daredeverall.com. If you want to support my channel even further, there are a number of ways you can do so. I've recently started a coffee account, so you can buy me a cup of coffee for narrating these stories to you if you like. I'm also going to be releasing an extended version of this collection of stories with one extra story on that coffee account. So keep an eye out for that. You can also check out my Teespring store and consider purchasing one of my shirt designs. Or head over to Audible, where there is a book, Punch, by J.R. Park that I narrated. I get a small royalty if you decide to purchase that. Thanks again for watching.